Every single node, of course, has sliders, and these sliders, of course, are operators, and they, of course, allow you to change the values. And the way this works is you can basically, you see, for example, I'm going to just put this back to 1. So you see, this is the saturation slider. So, of course, if I go all the way to 0, the image becomes black and white. If I go all the way to 4, the image gets hypersaturated. I can just type 1 for the natural thing. So there's a couple of ways of changing a slider. You can either, of course, move the slider around. But if you want, you can also go in here and type a specific number. So, for example, if I want 2.5 of saturation, that will be that value. You can also use the arrows on the keyboard. So, for example, if I go sideways, you can go through the decimals of all the values. And, for example, if I go to 2, I can go up on the arrows by going up and down on my values. Or I can keep going to the sides and then go up on my decimals point. And if I keep going, I can actually be even more aggressive with my values or less aggressive. So, for example, if I go here, I'm changing my saturation very little. But if I go here, I change my saturation a lot more. At any time, you can right-click and just say set to default. And if you set to default, it goes back to 1. Now, notice how there are actually values attached to the slider. So you have 0, 0, 1, 0, 4, 0, 7, 2, 3, 4. Now, different sliders in Nuke, like, for example, the gain goes all the way to 5, the saturation goes all the way to 4, different types of effects. For example, the offset only goes to -1 to 1, as opposed to the gain goes from 0 to 4. Because, of course, exposure, there's nothing more than 0 of exposure. And now, keep in mind that 4 is the maximum of this slider. And as you can see on the footage here, she's completely overexposed now. But everything in Nuke is a float value. So you could keep going and going and going and even have more exposure, although the value was only until 4 on the slider. Every slider in Nuke doesn't mean it's the limit of that slider. You can go beyond the values of that slider. And again, if you right-click and you can set to default. Now, of course, every slider is individual for its values. So, for example, this one makes contrast, this one makes midtones, this one makes multiplication, this one offsets the image, of course, and this one plays around with saturation. So you always have multiple controllers for multiple sliders. You can, if you don't want to, you can right-click and do set to default to one of them, or you can just go into the main node and right-click and you can actually set the key to all of them. You can set all of them to default, or revert them, or make no animation on all of them. That means if you have an animation, it will only keep the value that you are on that specific value. So I'm going to set all nodes to default, and that brings them back all to normal. I want to set a keyframe. I can, of course, also set the keyframe by pressing right-click and then press keyframe, and now it's blue. That means on that specific frame is a keyframe. If I go to another frame, it becomes light blue. That means is because we're not on that keyframe anymore. And if you look in the timeline, you can kind of see that there's a point where you see where that keyframe is. So if I go to, for example, this frame, and if I change the slider again, now I have 2 different keyframes. And of course, if I play this back, you basically get an animation between them. So now once it goes through one keyframe, it changes to the other keyframe and your saturation changes in your image. But don't worry, we'll talk a lot more about animation in the near future. Just wanted to give you a little heads up of how the nodes work, and this will, of course, what I introduced to you about here on the color corrector will be the same on every single node. Now let's talk about the next menu, which is the filter menu. Now it goes without saying that all these nodes are filters, and that's why they have this orange look. The reason why the denoise doesn't have orange is because it's not really a filter. The denoise is a node that actually is a GPU accelerated node, and it allows you to remove noise or grain from a plate. Let's start with the blur, the most common of them all. So if I open up the blur, you probably guessed it, what the blur is going to do. The blur is going to blur the image, and it's going to be by default a Gaussian blur, so that means that the blur has no edges. You can change this to quadratical blur, you can change it to triangle blur, or you can change to a box blur, and you can clearly see what that means. It blurs in shape of a box, or it blurs in shape of a triangle, as a quadratic blur, or a Gaussian blur. We'll talk more in detail about these kind of things later on. If I go into my defocus node, the defocus node is very different. The defocus node tries to mimic a lens. Notice also how slow it is to process. So if you look at a blur, the blur looks like a mush of blurriness on pixels, as opposed to the defocus, which has a lot more details like the bokeh and other things like sharp, but of course it's much slower to process. Again, we will talk about these nodes in very detail once we start comping and once we get into, you know, week 2, week 3, week 4. So don't worry, this is just a really simple introduction. Other things here as well, of course, is the directional blur, which we can pretend a direction. So for example, if we have a blur center, we can change and actually even fake directionals. We have, of course, edge blur. I don't have anything with edges or alpha channels. I can't show you that. The erode as well. We'll talk about that later once we talk about rotoscoping in roto. The glow is just like the word says, it makes glows. The sharpen node, of course, sharpens the screen. So if you look closely here, if I enable and disable, she looks sharper. Of course, there is a couple of problems with some edges that break because of the sharpness. And then, of course, last but not least, we have the Z defocus node, which requires a specific pass from CG called the Z pass, which allows you to do depth of field on CG images, and the motion blur. The motion blur node is a GPU accelerated node that allows you to pretend motion blur. So you can see, for example, here by default, I have a sample of 3 and a shutter of 0.7, and you can see our hand looks like it's blurred. And if I play this back, you can kind of see that it's trying to fake a motion blur effect that was not there on the camera. Especially on the hand here, you see how it breaks up the motion blur. Again, I know I keep talking like a broken record, but we will talk in detail about this once we go into filters in week 2. Of course, the keying menu, I'm not really going to talk much about it. We have a specific class on keying on week 3. Merging, also merging and editing and basically having the solves. It's going to really be much more obvious when we start having composites, because currently I only have one piece of footage. Transformations is something that I can show you really quickly how that works, because without saying what happens on these nodes, if I now decide to put a transform node on an image, I can of course scale that image. And of course, I can move it around, I can rotate that image, or I can even skew that image. I noticed that there are controllers on the viewer, which allow me to basically control the panning of that scale. It allows me to control the rotation of this scale, allows me to control the skewing of this scale. And notice how I change values here. It also changes values on my preferences here. So if I set this all to default, you can kind of see that I can rotate here as well individually. I can also scale here by using my sliders, and I can skew my image in here to do some of the Soundgarden effects from the music video from the 90s from Soundgarden, for example, if you want to. And just go back there. But of course, it's a lot easier to just use the controller on screen if you want to scale something on an image. Very important as well is the crop node. The crop node allows you to do things like this. You can actually crop an image. That means you can make an image only be visible on a certain area, and that means it will not process other parts of the screen. So now if I play back, you see there's a little window there. You can also hit the button called reformat, and now we've reformat that image to just this piece of footage. And so we're not viewing the rest of the footage. If I untick the reformat, it goes back to the original resolution and this little window. I also have the corner pinner. Now the corner pinner is going to be very useful for tracking objects, but as you can see, there's 4 points. And it allows you to just distort the image, or to, for example, track it into a, imagine you're trying to track it to a window, or you're trying to track it into a poster. Then you can change the corner pinner, and basically you get the image with those 4 corners. The mirror is very self-explanatory. We can flip the image by hitting the vertical flip, or we can flop the image by using the horizontal mirror as well. Last but not least, from the very important nodes, which also note that all of them are with this kind of purplish color. That means because they are all part of the transform tab, as opposed, for example, for the filters, which are orange, and as opposed to the color correctors, which mostly are blue or white. So if I use the reformat node, the reformat node allows you to, of course, reformat footage to another resolution. So give an example. If I put, for example, the original footage, so you see it's changing it to HD because that's the root of my settings, but I can change it to 720p. Let me just zoom in so you can kind of see the reformatting. So let's say that I change it to PAL. So now this is, of course, only 720 by 576. If I change it to 720p, it becomes a bit more high res. If I change it to HD, it becomes even better high res. Now, if I bring it back to Super 45, that's the original resolution we had. And if I change this, for example, to 4K, now it becomes more soft because I'm now scaling this to 4K. I'm basically blowing my pixels up to 4K. We are going to have an entire class in week 2 dedicated to filtering and reformatting. So we'll go more deep into the ways that we filter and transform images on that class. Now, we're not going to talk about the particles or the 3D system today, so I'm just going to wrap up everything here with just a merge node, which is one of the most important nodes that we will use inside of compositing. And I want to finish this class that we basically talked about nodes and categories in nodes by just doing a really short composite for you to check. But now that we have so many filters open, you can clearly see the different colors and categories of filters. Bring in some footage and let's do a really quick composite so that we can kind of see how this works. So just so you guys get used to this, I'm gonna do as I usually do. I'm gonna hit the R button to go to the read. I'm gonna go into my location. I'm actually going to pick up a bunch of footage. So I'm gonna go into the comp version here. I'm gonna pick up this EXR sequence, and then I'm gonna press next. Then I'm gonna go down to the render, and then I'm going to go to main background, version 16. I'm not gonna open all these different passes from CG. We'll discuss this when we go into CG compositing. I'm gonna select the main background EXR, press next, and then I'm gonna go to my main character, version 17. Again, I'm not gonna open all the passes, just open the main pass, and I'm gonna press next, and then I'm gonna press open. And that should open to me 3 different images. So I have basically gonna view this on the viewer. I'm gonna set my viewer to input because this node has different frame rates. So the frame ranges are from 1001 to 39, as opposed to Kali Minogue, which was all the way to 58. So I'm going to change my global settings on my viewer to input so that I can actually see it from 1001 to 39. This is the final composite of shot 60 of a Heroes Arena. This is a game cinematic that I directed about 2 years ago. I directed this cinematic, and I also was the lead compositor and supervisor of the cinematic as well, as I usually do when I direct something. I always tend to put my hands dirty on this comps. So this is the final composite with the main character, motion blur, atmospherics, backgrounds, depth of fields, and everything. But it all started with the original background, which is this. This is the actual background that was rendered from CG. So as you can see, this is the background. And then I have, of course, the main character, which is actually called Alvin. And this is the raw render from CG without any treatment, without any depth of field. It does have motion blur baked into the render. So this is the 2 images that we're going to play around with here. This exercise is really not really an exercise, just to show you the concept of something called merge, and it's called A over B. And this is the concept inside of Nuke of merging 2 objects. So the way that this works is that you tend to have a foreground object and you have a background object. Now the background object tends to be on the background, of course, and the foreground object goes to the foreground. And if I press the A button, or if I go in here to my alpha channel, which as you can see here, red, green, blue, alpha luminance, it's R, G, B, A, Y, or M. So if I go to A, I can see the alpha channel. And if I play it back, this is actually my alpha channel of this main character. So once there's an alpha channel, that means I can merge 2 objects together. And this, of course, means that I will use the merge node. The merge node can be found on the merge menu, or you can press the M button, or you can right click and go into the merge menu, and then you can find the merge node here, which is letter M. You can also have merges already with different types of blending options. It's very important for you to understand how Nuke works, and that's why I'm showing you this such a simple comp. At any time, the B pipe, and this is why this is called A over B, the B pipe should always be your background. That means you're going to plug in the B pipe into your background, and the A pipe will always go to your foreground. And that's why it's called A over B. A being foreground, B being background. Always memorize it by knowing the letter B should be for background. And why is this important? This is important because Nuke will always prioritize everything that is on the B pipe. That means that the resolution will be taken from the B pipe, the actual image will be taken from the B pipe, the channels will be taken from the B pipe, never from the A pipe. That's because the B pipe is your master pipe on a merge. If I now set my viewer to look at my result, and I press back into RGB here to see my result, you can clearly see that now I have my first composite. This is the first composite done in Nuke on this class. And this would be an A over B. You have the foreground element versus on top of the background element. Now I'm going to go back to the first frame and just really go through this. Now the way that this would work in terms of compositing would be that you would now start affecting, this is what node compositing really is, you would start affecting certain things to one layer and certain things to another layer. So let's, for example, say that, you know, this main character is too dark. He looks too dark and he's getting too merged into the background because maybe your lighting artist didn't really apply enough light to him. This means I could do a couple of things. I could actually bring in a grade node, and this, of course, this grade node can be summoned by going into our menus or right-clicking, or we can, of course, hit the G button. Now, if we hit the G button, the grade node stays outside our pipe. So there's a couple of ways of doing this. You can literally pick up the node and drag it into your script. So you see, once I go over a node tree, once I go over through a pipe, it becomes white. Once it goes white, you can let it go and it gets attached to that node. Now, keep in mind that this can also be done in a different way. We can also select that read node and hit the G button, and now the grade node is actually piped directly into where it should be. I'm going to do the same on the background by putting a grade node so that I can color correct that background as well. And here's the beauty of using node compositing. This means now I can always very rapidly look at just the background, look at just the foreground, look at just the result of my color correction, or look at the total merge of the two. Really quickly open up this grade node, and I'm going to bring up a bit of multiplication, so that's the highlights of the image, and I'm going to bring up a little bit of the gamma in the image and bring a bit more of the gain. So now you can see he's brighter. I'm also going to make things even more complicated by opening up the little color wheel on the gamma. Let's put a bit of a blue tint into him. So you see now we started with, if I select the read node with 1, you started with nothing. Select the grade node set to 1, you started with some color correction, and I go into the merge node select and press 1, I can see the result of it. At any time, I can just disable that node by selecting the node that I want to disable and press the D button, and that gives me the result of before and after of what I've done. Now I can do the same with the background. I'm going to open up the background, and I'm actually going to multiply up the highlights, but I'm going to basically bring down the midtones so it looks a bit more contrasted. I'm also going to go into the midtones, and I'm going to also give it a bit of a blue tint. So now, as you can see, my background is much darker and my foreground is much lighter. At any time, I can select both grade nodes and disable them both and actually see. So you see, originally, you can kind of see that this character was basically merged into the background. We can hardly understood him. With just these two simple color correctors, of course, they're a bit extreme. I would never do this extreme color correction, but as you can see now, I can see more of him and less of the background. And at any time, I can enable and disable these two nodes, and I can also just look at just the result of the background with this color correction, or just the result of the foreground with this color correction. And this is really the basic notion of A over B on a composite. One last thing that I wanted to show you is from an organizational point of view. We already talked about a backdrop. So for example, if I select these two, I can put a backdrop here and say that this is, if I double click on it, I can say that this is my foreground. And if I now select these two and hit backdrop again, I can say that this is my background node. And so now I have two backdrops explaining what each of these nodes are. And this is very useful for both moving around big massive comps or basically just organizing them so that anyone else that picks up your script, and I can tell you that if you're working on a big company and if you have a team of 20 or 30 operators, then we will share scripts in between because, you know, maybe someone gets sick, maybe someone has to maybe you have to help someone to finish a shot. Another thing you can do is also the dots to organize the script better. Now, the dot is, of course, if you press the dot button on the keyboard. So if I press dot, a dot will show up. And this means that this dot can be plugged into anywhere so that you can actually, if I press the dot again, you can actually move around the pipes and you can organize them a bit better so that they can actually be where you want them to be. You can also press at any moment the command key in a Mac, I believe it's a different key on Windows. I don't have Windows here with me. But if you hit the Command key on the Mac, you'll see these yellow dots. That means if I press on them, I get even more dots. And that will happen anytime I press that same key. And that allows me to basically move around and make different shapes to the node graph. And of course, this looks really silly, but it would work if you're organizing a big script. Now, of course, I can select just the dots and just get rid of all the dots, of course, at the very end and not have any dots whatsoever. Before we go, I would also like to let you know that the most important thing inside of Nuke is if you want to know more about any node whatsoever, like I told you, you can just hover the mouse over anything and it tells you exactly what it is. For example, on the merge node, all the different blending operations that you have, just like in Photoshop. If you leave the mouse over the blending operations, it actually tells you the mathematical equations for every single blending mode. The same goes for every slider. It tells you what it does. And never, ever underestimate the help file. On every node in Nuke, there's a little question mark on every single one of them. The question mark icon on the merge node, you will require to have, of course, a connection to the internet. It will tell you exactly what the merge node is. It will give you details. It will show you everything about that node. And it even has step-by-step guides about them. Give an example. If I go to my grade node, and I select the little question mark, click on it, and it goes to the Foundry's website and tells me everything about the grade node and what every single slider does. The help file in Nuke is very good, and as you can see, it's divided by every single thing, so you can look at the color corrector, you can look at the color space node, you can look at every node, so don't underestimate the help file. The help file is super powerful, and even myself, with 20 years of experience, I still go to the help file all the time. Don't be ashamed of going to the help file. Now, it goes without saying that some people really take the nodes and the dots really seriously. I think we should definitely do a competition of art using nodes and dots. These are just 3 examples I found on the web. You can do a circle of dots, or you can even do a spiral of dots if you want to. These are just 3 examples of art, dot art, what I'm calling it now. And of course, someone actually explaining how the dot works by writing the word dot. We definitely should do a competition to do who makes the best dot image. I actually should talk with the Foundry about this and make a competition, maybe an award or a prize to anyone that makes the best drawing just using dots inside of Nuke. This was it for this class. I hope you've enjoyed the class. If you have any questions, because I know we covered so much stuff today, if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to contact us directly, or you can contact us on the forums so other people see the questions as well. Always prefer to do that because then everyone kind of can contribute with answers as well. Hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you on the next class.